to this point in this lesson, we've talked about dates, regular expressions, and built-in string methods, but we haven't talked about arrays, and this is where it gets really fun. Now, I will say that this list of methods that we're going to be going through, you can actually see them on the screen, all of these different methods here. So we have the push, pop, shift, and unshift. Those are kind of grouped together. We have slice, splice. These are actually different. We have findIndex and indexOf. They're kind of grouped together. Map, forEach, includes, filter, and reduce. And I chose these because these are the ones that you're going to be using most of the time. And these represent kind of the bulk, if we can kind of go with that whole 80-20 rule. This is the 80-20 rule of array methods. And it's obviously not exhaustive, and I'm not going to go into every last detail of each method, but I hope that this can basically walk you through the basics of each so that when you have to use them, it's not a complete shock. You kind of know what's available to you, which is kind of half the battle sometimes. Just remember, these are not to memorize. Don't try to memorize these. Like any built-in method, you can always look them up, and as I've been going through in this video, you know how to read the documentation now, and I'll continue doing that for each of these array methods so that you can just get better and better at acquainting yourself with the different syntax of this documentation. So let's get started. We'll start with the push, pop, shift, and unshift methods. And we're not going to really go through all of these in the documentation because they're so similar. But let's go to JavaScript again, built-in objects, and we're going to the array object, which has instance methods that we're going to be looking at here. All right, so we will start with pop. We've actually already looked at this when we talked about reading documentation. This is going to remove the last element from an array. Now, we also have shift right here. This is going to remove the first element of the array. Then you have the method that we're going to be using the most out of all of these, which is the push method. This just takes an element or more than one element and adds it to the end of the existing array. And then finally, the unshift method down here somewhere. This is going to add an element or elements at the beginning of the array. Again, I think the push method is probably going to be the most widely used, but let's just go ahead and see what we're dealing with here. So we'll make an array, we'll add 3 elements in there, and maybe let's go ahead and put a gap in there. So we'll skip 4 and we'll put in 5 and 6 or something like that. All right, so there's our array. So what if we wanted to basically add the 4 in there? So basically all we have to do is array.pop. That's going to take off the 6, and it returns 6 not because the value is 6, but because there are 6 elements, or maybe it did. It does return the element that it removed from the array. I'm sorry about that. All right. Anyways, we will go and do that again because we need to remove one more. So now our array looks like this. We just have 1, 2, 3, and now we can push 4, 5, and 6 to the end, and we are back to what we started with, but this time it has all of the numbers in order. So of course we can add the 0 at the beginning, so we just say array.unshift, put a 0 in there, and now our array has 0 through 6. So you can kind of get an idea of how this works, and there's not a whole lot to it. All right, let's move on to the slice method. Now this one is going to come in handy when you need to make a copy of an array. And this is not going to be apparent why this is useful right now, but once you start getting into front-end programming where you're writing code in either Angular or React or Vue.js or something like that, there's this concept that we call state, which basically it's how the data flows through the front end of your application, and when a user updates their profile or whatever, and that data update affects another part of the application, the state is what makes those changes propagated across the entire application. And when we're dealing with state, we often are dealing with immutable objects, things that cannot be changed. So making a copy of the data that you're putting into state is going to be extremely useful. And to do that, you can use this slice method. So let's look at it in the documentation. We'll go to slice. It says it returns a shallow copy of a portion of an array. When it says shallow here, that just means that you have, like, if you have nested objects or arrays, it's not going to pick up on those. It only gets like the first layer or whatever. You'll need a more advanced method to do like a deep copy of an object, and I'll talk about that a little bit later in this lesson. So basically what it's doing is it's taking two optional parameters. So if we don't supply any sort of parameters at all, then it's just going to, let's see what it says. So if we don't put any parameters at all, it's just going to create a copy of the entire thing. Otherwise, it will create a copy of a specific part of an array. So let's see how this works. We have an array already right here, but let's say that we wanted to take out 2, 3, and 4 or something like that. So we've already got an array on the screen, and let's say that we wanted to make a copy of the entire thing. So we can say copy of the array is going to be array.slice. We don't need to pass in any parameters because we just want the entire thing. And now the copy of the array is going to be a perfect copy. Now, if you were to compare these, so copy of the array versus the array, they're not going to be equal. So I say that loosely, but that is a concept that we talked about when we looked at the JavaScript operators in a previous lesson. All right, so if we wanted to grab like a specific part of this array, so another copy, and we want to grab everything starting at 3 till the end of the array, you might say slice, and then you want to give it an index of not 0, not 1, not 2, but you want to start at 3, so you want to give it an index of 3. And now another copy is going to be equal to 3, 4, 5, 6. So that's just a quick overview of the slice method. The next method that we're dealing with is called splice, and it is not to be confused with slice. So if we go to the documentation, click on splice, it will say that this method changes the contents of an array by removing or replacing existing elements and or adding new elements in place. So in other words, this is useful if unshift and push, those two methods we learned about, are not sufficient. You want to actually replace something in the middle of the array rather than just the beginning or the end. Now I want to look at the function signature on this one because it's kind of interesting. So there's a lot going on, but the only required parameter is the start, which is the index at which you want to start changing the array. Then the comma here, it says we're going to a new parameter. We want the delete count. So it's basically saying we want to start at a specific index, and now we need to specify how many items of that array are we going to delete starting at that index. Now, if we don't provide this because it is entirely optional, it says if this is omitted or if its value is equal to or larger than the array.length minus the start, we don't need to get into that, then all the elements from start to the end of the array will be deleted. So let's say that we specified the start as index of 1, then it's going to basically delete everything except for that first element. So the next part that we have are these interesting brackets where we just have item 1, item 2, and then the ... This is basically saying that you can have an infinite number of parameters that you can replace, and it looks like if we come down here to item 1 to ... it says the elements to add to the array beginning from start. If you do not specify any elements, splice will only remove elements from the array. So this kind of changes the behavior of the entire method. We go from removing elements to adding elements to the array. So you can see how reading the documentation can be very helpful. In our case, we're just going to go through a basic example. So we'll say that our array is going to be equal to 1, 2, 3, and then we'll put in some string that doesn't belong there, 4, 5, 6. All right, so what if we wanted to, well, hold on. I cleared the screen but did not refresh, and I tried to redeclare that array variable. So let's try again. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And what if we wanted to remove that string from there? So all we'd have to do is array.splice, and then we want to specify that we want to start at the index of 3. So this is 0, 1, 2, and then 3. So we want to start at the index of 3. We want to remove a single element. So we just want to put in a 1 right there. And then at the end, we can put in, let's say, what we want to replace it with. So in this case, we want to remove this string and replace it with something. So maybe something in between. We'll put 3.5 or something. All right, so it returns the item that was removed, and now our new array has the replacement value in there. So at this point, I think it's a good time to just briefly mention the fact that we are mutating this array right here. Now, when we looked at string methods, none of those methods actually modified the existing string. And that is because an array is not a primitive value. Now, a string is a primitive value, and for that reason, it is immutable and you cannot change it. Now, an array is mutable, so that means that these methods that we're using are actually editing the array itself, and you don't have to basically create copies. You could if you use the slice method, though. All right, so the next one that we're dealing with is going to be the findIndex and indexOf method. So here's the findIndex. It returns the index of the first element, so only one, that satisfies the provided testing function. All right, so this is where we start getting into the callback functions that I talked about. So if you don't understand callback functions, be sure to go to that prior part of the lesson here and really wrap your head around those, because from here moving forward, we're going to be dealing with them in pretty much every array method. Anyways, it says if there's no match, so if your testing function does not match an element, you're going to get a value of -1. So we know that if this method returns us -1, then what we're trying to match does not exist in the array. Otherwise, we get the index to grab it from. Now, this is kind of similar, so the findIndex is kind of similar to the indexOf method. So if we come down here and grab the indexOf method, it's just going to return the first index where the given element is found. There's no such thing as this, callback function that matches or anything. We're just searching for a specific string. And again, this will return -1 if that is not present. Now, this is a little bit less powerful, and like I said, callback functions enable reusability. In this case, we just search for a raw string. With the findIndex, we can specify an entire testing function. So in this case, if you can grasp your head around these callback functions, the findIndex is going to be a little bit more powerful for you. So let's see if we can come up with a good example for this. We'll use what we got for the indexOf method. So again, array is equal to this right here. And we could just say array indexOf, and maybe we want to look for that value of 3.5. And it's going to give us an index of 3. So what we could do here is we could basically say, okay, I want to get that value here, so we can say array, then we can use the bracket notation. We obviously have to pass in an index, and then we can find this index. It's kind of circular here, but I'm just trying to show you how this might be used. And then we pass in there, and now we can actually get the value. So previously we just looked at for the index right here, but now we're actually getting the value returned because we used that index and grabbed it from the array. All right, so that's how you use indexOf. Now let's talk about how you might use the findIndex method for a little bit more powerful search. Now, what if you had a more complex array like this? This has obviously got a lot more to it. It's got objects that have two properties, first name and last name. Now, if you tried to use the indexOf method, so more complex array, and then you used indexOf, and then you started putting an object in here and typing out first name equals Bob, so on and so forth, you're not going to get a match. It will never match because you can't do that kind of equality comparison. So all we have to do is use the findIndex. So this is going to return us the index of the first match that we have identified within this array. So let's say that we want to identify any or we want to identify the first item in this array where the last name does not equal Smith. So that's obviously the last value, and that would be the 0, 1, 2, third index. So we expect an index of 3 to be returned. And what this expects as an argument, if we go to the findIndex again, you'll see that we need to return a callback, and that callback is going to have a couple of arguments that we can use here. So let's look at this real quick. The callback has an element, so that's the current element being processed in the array. That's not new to us. We have the index of the array. We probably don't need that. And then we have the original array that we're looking at, and we probably don't need that as well. And then finally, we have another argument after the callback, and it says optional object to use as this when executing the callback. We haven't talked about the this keyword yet, so we're not going to worry about that. All right, so we need to pass in a callback. Let's go ahead and populate that with the array item, and that's all we're going to use here. We could have passed in the index in the original array, but we don't need to. And then in this case, since we're searching for anything that does not equal Smith, we can just say where array item dot last name does not equal Smith. All right, so what this is going to do is return us a value of 3, which is the index of the first element that is not Smith, which happens to be this last object down here, John Doe. So you can see how powerful this is as compared to the indexOf method. There's a lot more things you can do with it, but as I said, this is just an overview of each method. The next method we're looking at is the map method. Now, we've already looked at this in the documentation a little bit earlier in this lesson. Let's look at it once more. This was the method we kind of used to prove out the reusability thing. But basically, if we look at the parameters that we can put in here, it says that we have a callback function, and then similar to the previous method we just looked at, we have the this arg, which we haven't covered anything about that, so we're not going to get into it. So basically, if you remember, this is just a transformation function, and it's going to loop through an array and perform a transformation according to your callback function on each element in the array. So let's consider this array right here where we have blog posts from a database, and in this case, all of them are uncategorized. So what if we wanted to return a new array, but in the new array, the category is going to be set to something like web development? Well, all we would have to do is use the map method. Now, of course, you could, type it out and say blog post from database, and then go at 0, and then type in the category and set it equal to something, but that's going to get really clunky and slow. So what we need to do is say blog post from database dot map. Now this is where we pass in our map function, so we're going to pass in the array item. So as we go through each item, the first thing that we need to do is we need to modify that actual property, and then we need to return the item in full. So we'll say array item dot category equals web development. All right, so there we have modified this individual array item's category property, and now we're going to return the array item which has been modified. All right, so we'll press enter, and now you can see this map function returns the following array, and in this case, we now have the category updated for all of these properties. So this would be a really useful function to do in the real world, and I've actually used something very similar to this example in some of my apps. So it's super realistic and super helpful. It will save you a lot of time. Next up in our lineup is the forEach method, and until this point we've been looking at arrays and looping through arrays in one specific way. So this is how we've been doing it. If we have an array that has a couple values in it, now we write our for loop. So we initialize I to 0, we go until I is less than the array.length, and then we increment I. Then we drop down into the for loop, and we're going to do something here. So maybe we're just going to print the element of the array that we're at. So there you go, prints it, and we can do all sorts of stuff within that code block. Now there's another way to write a for loop that we haven't talked about yet, and that is the forEach method on an array. So here's how we would do that. We would say array.forEach, and now what's going to happen is we have a callback function that gives us the array item, and then we drop down into the function and we can once again console.log the array item. All right, so that's just a simple way to replicate that array up there. You can also get the index. So if we looked at the documentation of the forEach method, it's going to say, here's our callback that we're looking at, and it's going to pass us the current value, and it's going to pass us the index in the original array. So again, this signature right here, the function signature is going to be very similar, if not the same, for pretty much all of these more advanced array methods. So in this case, if we wanted to take this for loop, so let's clear the screen once more. Here's our array that we're looking at. And if we wanted to do the for loop, we use forEach. We want the array item, and then we can grab the index. So in this case, we have two things to work with, and we'll console.log, say the array item, and then we will enter down and console.log the index, and you can see that we are printing the value of 1, which has a 0 index, the value of 2, which has a 1 index, and the value of 3, which has number 2 index. So this is really useful, a little bit quicker than our other for loop. Now there are a couple differences, but nothing that we need to talk about right now. You'll find those out as you start programming, and I'll try to point them out within this series if we stumble upon them. The next method that we're talking about is the includes method. So this is going to help you find a single element and determine whether it exists within an array. So there are multiple ways to do this, and I'll show you a couple different ways and kind of prove out why the includes method might be the best in a lot of cases. So let's say that you have the following array. You have my colors. You want to figure out whether the color orange exists within this array using some code. Now there are a couple ways that you can do this, but one way that we can use is what we're basically accustomed to seeing, and we're going to initialize this variable right here. We'll say that it's false, and then if, when we're looping through this array, if any of the colors equals orange, then we set that variable to true, and now we can figure out if orange exists, which should be true. So that's one way to do it, but there is a simpler way to do it with the forEach method. So we could say something like this. So we've already got the orange exist variable, and all we'd have to do is loop through it that way, set it to true, and we can say orange exist, and that is going to be equal to true. Now there is a even simpler way, and it's using the includes method. So all we would have to say is my colors dot includes, and then type orange, and it's going to tell us true. That does exist in the array. So as you can see, it's a lot easier to use a method like this than go through all of those for loops and, store the value in a variable and stuff like that. Now, just to connect the dots here and show you that there's a variety of ways to solve problems within coding, you could have also used the indexOf method. So if we would have said my colors, and then you say indexOf, and then you type orange, and you return that, it's going to give you an index of 3. So basically, all you would have to say is that statement right there, and you say if that does not equal -1, then our item exists in the array. Because if it returns -1, then it didn't find it, and we know that it doesn't exist. So that's just another way to solve it, and hopefully you've seen that there are, in this case, there are 4 different ways that I went through, something like that, of checking whether something exists in an array. The next method that we're going to use is filter, and this is probably the most frequented method for me. This is the one that I use the most, probably. I don't know for sure, but this one and map are probably the two that I would use the most within my code. Now the filter method does exactly what you think it would do. It filters out different results. So let's say that you go on Amazon and you go to your orders page. It might look something like this. You know, this is fictitious. It's not actually what their data model is going to look like. But you can see that maybe we have some different properties on our orders array, and this is going to represent all of the orders. But you know, when you go on Amazon, you can click on buttons and filter those orders by date, by whether they're open, whether they're canceled, or whether they're digital. And we can do this with the filter method, which is basically going to return us an array that has been filtered based on a callback function that we provide to it. So with this array, you can see that we have this isDigital property, so we could find all of the digital products. We could save that to an array by saying digital orders, and then we'll set that equal to all orders dot filter. And now this is where we pass in our callback function, which again receives the array item, and then we will pass that in to our function and return anything that is digital. So we'll say array item dot is digital, which is a Boolean. So if it's true, then we're going to return a true value, and it's going to be included in our resultant array. So now our digital orders, if we print that out, you'll see that we have two of them, and it says is digital true, so we know that we matched those correctly. Now there's a couple other filters that we could do. We could paste in this and say, okay, we want all of the digital and canceled orders. So we're returning a condition where it says we want to check if it is digital and it is canceled. So in this case, we can print this array digital canceled orders, and we only have one of those where you can see is digital is true and is canceled is also true. So this is a super useful method, and it's often used on the front end where you're, like I said, on your orders page on Amazon, and you click the button and it might execute this filter method and just show the user whatever is filtered. So this is really useful. I use it all the time on the front end, and you can even use it on the back end a little bit as well. Now I saved the hardest for last, of course, because I didn't anticipate the fact that I'd be talking for such a long period of time, but we're going to go ahead and try this anyways. This is the reduce method. So if we look at the reduce method within the documentation, it's going to give us a very interesting callback function. So instead of the array item and then the index and then the original array that we get passed into our callback, it's going to give us some interesting parameters. So it gives us the accumulator, it gives us the current value, and then it gives us some optional parameters here, index and then the original array. And then finally, we pass in addition to the callback, an initial value that we want to initialize this accumulator to. So I'm not going to go through all of these. I'm going to put this into terms that I think we can all kind of recognize. So let's go ahead and paste this in, and this is the code that you're probably used to seeing. So if we wanted to find the sum of this array, so we wanted to add all of these numbers together, this is how we would do it, and this is how we did it in the 25 coding challenges that we practiced for the previous lesson. So in this case, we initialize a sum variable to equal 0. So we start the count at 0, then we loop through our array, and for each element in the array, we add it to the sum using the plus equals operator. And then at the end, we console log the sum, which is going to equal 99, because that's the sum of all of these values in the array. Now, what I want to point out is the fact that this sum variable is essentially accumulating values. So it's basically called our accumulator. So if we go back to the documentation, it shows that the first argument of this callback is the accumulator. So you can think of this as our sum variable that we just wrote right here. So what I'm going to do is right below here, I'm going to rewrite all of this code, but using the reduce method. So the first thing I'll do is write our reducer callback function. And what this callback function is going to do is it's going to accumulate the value. So if you look at the documentation, it's going to first take this accumulator parameter, which is basically going to act as this sum variable right here. So up top, we defined it like outside of the for loop, but here we can just pass it in as a parameter to the callback. And then we have an array item, so that's going to be another parameter. And we have others, but we don't need them. So let's go ahead and just use this. And now what we're going to do is we're going to return a value. So we always return a value from the callback for each array item. And in this case, this sum variable is going to be accumulated over the course of looping over this array. So the reduce method automatically takes care of that and makes sure that that accumulates a value. So all we have to do is say sum plus or equal array item. And what this is going to do is exactly the same thing that we're doing up here, but we're adding the array item and we're doing it all within a callback function. So let's define that. And now we can say that we want our result to be equal to array.reduce. So we're using the reduce method, and we need to pass in our reducer callback, and then we need to pass in one more thing. So if you go over to the syntax, you'll see that we have the callback, which is encompassed in the highlight right here. But then you'll see after that highlight, we have a comma and then another parameter called initial value. And if you come down and read about the initial value, it's basically saying that this will represent the starting value of this sum variable that gets passed in for every iteration. So we want to start that at 0, just like we started the sum up here at 0. And when we press enter and print the result, we're going to get 99, which has done the same thing as our code above. So while it looks very confusing, it is very confusing, you can kind of anchor yourself to this more simplistic code that we've already written and already understand. So that is the reduce method, and the last thing I want to show you about it is how you can use this to basically get the average of numbers in an array. So we went through some practice problems in the 25 practice problem video previous to this lesson, and we had to calculate an average of an array, I believe. And of course, there is no average method on the array object. I'm not sure why. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. But you can use this reduce method to actually calculate your own average of the array in just a single line. Here's how you're going to do that. All right, so we're going to say array.reduce, and then we're going to, of course, pass in the sum and then the array item. So we're writing the same thing that we have written already. We're just going to do this in one line. So we're going to take the sum plus or equal the array item. All right, so what this should give us right here is going to be equal to, of course, after we pass in our initial value, that's going to give us the sum of the array. And then all you have to do is divide that total by the array.thelength, and now you have retrieved the average of this array. So that's just a way that this can be really useful, and you might take a second to look at this code and see what it's doing, because it's a little bit confusing as a one-liner like this. But anyways, that's just a really practical example. It's something that I've used before in writing actual code. All right, so that is the end of the most common built-in array methods. Now you might be wondering, well, what happens if I find an operation that doesn't have a method already built for it? And the answer to that is you probably will be using some sort of external library to do that. And the most common one for us JavaScript developers is going to be the Lodash library. So if you type in Lodash and you click here, this is a modern JavaScript utility library delivering modularity, performance, and extras. And if you go to the documentation, you'll see on the left that at the top we have our array data type, and you'll see that we have a bunch of different methods that we can do all sorts of really interesting things with. So we have a limited set of built-in JavaScript objects, but the developers of Lodash have taken it a step further and basically created some additional methods. So if you remember, something that was tough for us is comparing the equality of two objects. So if we go in here and create two objects, so we'll say object 1 and we'll set that equal to prop1 and some value. All right, and then we have object2, and then we want to just set that perfectly equal to this. All right, so we put that in there, and now if we try to compare them, it's going to say false, and that's going to stay false even if we use double equals. And that's because we can't compare the equality of two objects. And if you wanted to write a function that actually compares the equality of two objects, it's going to take you hundreds of lines of code. But if you use the Lodash library, you can actually look at something. Let's go down here a little bit. And we have this method called isEqual. And this isEqual can actually take two objects, as you see here. So these are basically the example we just came up with. And it checks if they're equal, and it returns true. And behind the scenes, this library is running hundreds of lines of code to make this comparison. And you can see how we can extend our functionality by using external libraries. Now, of course, we have not looked at this. We don't know how to use external libraries yet in this course, but I promise we will get there soon. But just wanted to show you Lodash since we're talking about JavaScript built-in methods, and this is very, very applicable to this discussion.